Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm really sorry that I couldn't make it to Vancouver, but I'm happy to be here. I'm going to change a lot the language. So this is going to be a lot of policy, regulatory law kind of thing, not scientific. And I'm going to be talking today about the enabling conditions to unlock the potential of blue carbon. But first, to set quickly a common ground, we have to recognize that coastal and marine ecosystems are true climate and nature champions. Coastal wetlands such as salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrass, they are one of the most productive ecosystems, and they contribute in different ways. They are essential to fight climate change. Example, wetlands store up to 10 times more carbon per hectare than terrestrial rainforest, but they are also key to coastal resilience and coastal communities. It is critical for biodiversity, and they are central for livelihood for local communities around the world. Despite all this importance, coastal ecosystems are in decline. We have experienced an important coverage of mangrove, tidal marsh, and seagrass, and 20% of the loss that we have had happened recently between 1980 and 2005. But we are continue losing these ecosystems, mainly because of unsustainable human activities. In addition to all these, blue carbon ecosystems are undervalued and underfunded, and that's why at Fair Carbon we believe that this is the time to tackle these different challenges through the voluntary carbon market. So that is why at the organization we address different barriers, but today I'm just going to focus on the policy side, where we have identified that there are different challenges and the legal landscape and political landscape around blue carbon changes a lot and continuously. And there's also a lack of available information in just one place where we can find the country's regulation around this topic. And that is why we created the enabling conditions country profiles, where we assess different countries and identify if they are ready or not, for example, for blue carbon investment and project development. Now to start diving into the enabling conditions that we analyze at Carbon, the country profiles have four major components where we want to assess the core legal requirements to develop blue carbon projects. The first component is precedence of nature-based carbon projects, where we identify if the country has any ongoing involvement with mangrove or other nature-based carbon initiatives registered in the voluntary carbon market. The second component, we analyze all the different carbon market policies and regulations in these countries, and we also identify one key aspect, and is the legality of owning carbon rights and sell these nature carbon credits on the VCM. The third component is land tenure rules, and here we identify how secure land tenure is. And for example, if there are different permissions that are required to use the project area for commercial purposes. And the last component is Article 6, where we analyze the different rules and regulations related to the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that facilitates cooperative approaches between countries. In addition to these, in the country profiles that we design, we include a complementary policy analysis, and here we identify the different economic and political aspects of the country, environmental conditions, if there are climate change registries, monitoring and evaluation requirements, benefit sharing mechanisms, etc. Now, in this assessment that we do of the four core components that I previously mentioned, in each of the components, we have a set of questions that we score, and the final result will indicate if a country is positioned, has a traffic light indicator result. The red is it means that there's unfavorable enabling conditions. Yellow means that there are ambiguous enabling conditions, and green means that there are favorable enabling conditions based on the different methodology that we use and the questions. Now, in terms of results, so far we have built 11 country profiles from the countries that you see on your right. The ones with the magnifier lens are under reviewed, but will be released soon. But so far we found that 5 countries are located in green, which means favorable enabling conditions, and 6 with ambiguous results. We haven't found any countries in red, which is, I think, a good thing. But I just want to clarify that a country positioned in green doesn't mean that everything is perfect. It means that there are basic things related to policy and the regulatory framework that will allow the development of blue carbon projects, specifically high integrity blue carbon projects. Now let's start diving in more into the results. In the first components, that is precedence of nature-based carbon projects, we found that countries that we have assessed have more experience hosting nature-based carbon projects from non-blue carbon ecosystems on the VCM. The countries with most experience with blue carbon projects are Indonesia and Kenya. Indonesia is currently hosting 4 projects, blue carbon projects, and Kenya 3. And we know that Mikoko Pamoja, that is a worldwide renowned project, is hosted in Kenya with successful results, specifically for community development. The ones in gray, they are under development, so there's a growing interest in countries to start developing this type of projects. In terms of the carbon markets or carbon rights, I'm gonna talk about 4 different aspects here. The first is that we found that in general, there's a lack of clear regulations, with few countries having established carbon rights rules. And for example, we found that only Australia and Indonesia, from the countries we analyzed, they have a national carbon market established. Australia have way more experience if we compare with Indonesia. Indonesia just started their national carbon market last year in 2023. So they are new and they are starting to build in the different protocols and guidelines. Other than that, there are no national carbon markets. So the projects, for example, don't have additional criteria or requirements in the other countries related to carbon markets. Now, in terms of the legality, for example, to sell nature-based credits on the voluntary carbon markets, we found that the countries, they don't always have explicit rules, such as in Tanzania, Papua New Guinea, Kenya, Australia, Philippines, and Indonesia. In some countries, there are implicit regulations about the legality of selling nature-based credits on the VCM, mostly, for example, through forestry laws or regulations. And for example, in Mozambique, it is through the REDD+ strategy decree that they have specifically for these type of projects. So in general, there are not explicit rules about nature-based credits in the voluntary carbon market. Now, in terms of permissions that project developers, for example, need to seek in order to trade these credits on the VCM, we found that just a few countries have a more regulated aspect about this, which is, for example, something that project investors seek. For example, a government agency has to authorize or have everything has to be included in the National Carbon Registry, which is the case of Indonesia, Australia, Kenya, Tanzania, and Papua New Guinea. In other countries, it's unclear or unknown. And for example, in Mozambique, there's always there has to be a land use management plan, but that doesn't mean that it's something specific to trade on the voluntary carbon market. Now, to close on this slide about carbon rights, when I refer about carbon rights is who has the right to own and trade the carbon that is being sequestered, right? Which is going to be at the end trade. And this is key for project developers. We found a few countries that have a clear definition of carbon rights in the law, Indonesia and Australia. But Papua New Guinea, for example, had a definition in 2021. Then they changed the regulation in 2023, where they repealed the concept and didn't offer a new one. So there's a little bit of ambiguity there. And in other regulations, like in the forestry regulations, in Kenya, Philippines, Vanuatu, and Tanzania, they define carbon right sequestration. And in other countries, it is unclear what that means and how that carbon right can be transferred, for example, or not to other parties, either project developers or community owners. Now, in terms of the third component, that is land tenure, I'm going to quickly talk about this. This is just to have like a common ground. Land tenure systems are complex. They can be clearly defined by law, and they can, for example, mix customary aspects, which means the traditional ownership of communities and local people. They can be clearly defined or ambiguous, but these systems, either that is defined in law or customary or the mix of this, is going to always define how land is going to be allocated, transferred, used, managed, and improved. And in the analysis that we have conducted, I'm sorry for the mix of flags here, but I'm sending a message with these flags is land tenure systems can have, for example, the state ownership of mangroves, private ownership, customary, and leases are concessions only to use that piece of land, for example, for an amount of period. So here we found, for example, something really curious is that private ownership of mangroves is not always allowed in the different countries. It is, I would say, kind of uncommon, and all the countries have different regulations about leases and concessions that will vary the amount of time, and this, for example, will affect permanence periods that the international carbon standards require, etc. So this is a really important rule about like leases, concessions, and the time they are allowed. Another aspect that we found here is that the governance framework for nature-based community-owned projects is not always in place, and there's limited support on this. And why is this important? Because a lot of communities, a lot of people rely on these ecosystems, and starting a blue carbon project will change the behavior in terms of how they use their resources and if they participate or not in these projects. So governance framework are key for this. But there's still some ambiguity in some countries, and in Tanzania, Kenya, Philippines, and Jamaica, there is a nature-based community-owned projects governance. It's mostly through joint management of mangrove areas. Now, in terms of Article 6, that will allow cooperative approaches between countries, it is soon for all countries to have some sort of a specific regulatory frameworks on this, but some countries are leading the way. For example, Kenya in 2023, they established a national authority that has to authorize the participation in projects under Article 6 of the Paris Agreements, which includes corresponding adjustments and the internationally transfer mitigation outcomes agreements. Tanzania is doing something similar.
Maria Cecilia, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're just running a little behind time. Would you be able to wrap up and then stay with us for questions after the center?
Yes,
You've
I
done
can jump to the conclusions.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So other countries are starting agreements with Article 6 of ITMOS. And just to wrap up, I was about to do that. We have 4 big conclusions to increase the supply of high quality blue carbon projects. The first one is to continue strengthening blue carbon project development by boosting technical capacity and interchange of experiences. All countries need to implement specific regulations about the requirements for nature-based projects in the voluntary carbon market and explicit regulations about carbon rights. Clarity about land tenure is key with community-based governance frameworks, and the countries to continue creating regulations around Article 6 to promote these cooperative approaches. This is the QR code and link if you want to access these country profiles, and we have more to come. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out via email. Thank you.